All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to my very first webinar, Redefining Normal, Harnessing the Power of Emotional Intensity and Passion. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, one that I present frequently at conferences and in keynotes, and I'm very excited to bring it to you this evening. As we are moving forward tonight, you'll notice on my webpage there is a chat roll box. I would love it if you guys would kind of let me know that you're here. Let me know if you have any questions as we go through everything tonight. And I'll certainly be looking for that interaction when it comes to some of the things we'll be doing a little later on. First, though, I want to give you a little bit of information about me. My name is Christine Fonseca, and my background is that of a school psychologist. I worked for a number of years with K-12 education, working as a school psychologist, and that's actually how I wound up being part of writing on this topic of giftedness and whatnot. In addition to being a school psychologist by trade, I'm an educational consultant. I've authored about 8 self-help books and another 8 novels, and I speak internationally on this topic and others, and I'm super excited. Beth, welcome, and the guest who's here, welcome. I'm glad that you guys are joining us this evening. So I'm super excited to bring this topic to you tonight. What I'm hoping to do is really help everyone understand the true nature of emotional intensity, how best we can serve our kids, how we can help them make it a super power, as I feel that it is. In addition to all of the training I've done in this area, I'm also the parent of 2 gifted children, and like many of you have probably experienced, we have lots of intensity at our house. Between the kids, I'm a gifted adult, my husband's a gifted adult, so there's just a lot of intensity at our house. As you can see from the slide, I'm also going to give some things away today. To enter, all you have to do is at some point this evening, use that chat box. Let me know one way in which emotional intensity is a superpower, either for you or for your children. And at some point in the evening, I'll select a couple of random participants, and you guys will get a chance to win a book. And if you already have the book, then you can certainly give it away to a friend. I'm going to do the drawing at the very, very end of the evening tonight. Our time together will be about an hour, and I'm excited to be able to do that as well. So like I said, I see that we have some participants. Hi, everybody. I'm so excited that you're here. And why don't we go ahead and get started? So why did I pick the topic of emotional intensity? Well, as I was doing some research forever ago, it seems like now, probably 20 years ago, I was doing some research for some parenting classes, and I really started to do quite a bit of research around the field of giftedness. And I discovered, besides the fact that at that time there wasn't a lot of research to be found, I discovered that there was a theme that I was hearing amongst parents of gifted children and amongst gifted children themselves. And that was this feeling of being emotionally hardwired in a way that was just more intense than anyone else. And for our gifted kids and the gifted adults that I was working with at the time, that emotional intensity became a bit of a barrier. It was something that they were often embarrassed by. It was something that bothered them. It was something that they weren't as proud of as they were their cognitive intensity. And for myself as a gifted adult, I distinctly remember growing up feeling emotionally at odds at times. I really struggled, I guess, sometimes feeling like I fit in. And a lot of that came down to how I was experiencing the world from an emotional viewpoint. And I love that you guys are participating and writing some things, and thank you so much. So I wanted to pick this topic of emotional intensity because I feel like it's gotten a bad rap amongst the lay people. out there. And I really think it's time that we redefine what emotional intensity is for our gifted kids. But to do so, we have to have a really strong understanding of it. So this is one of my favorite quotes that's going to come up on your screen by a woman by the name of Pearl Buck. She actually said this during a commencement address at one point. And I think it sums up what we're talking about a lot with our gifted kids. The truly creative mind in any field is no more than this: a human creature born abnormally, inhumanly sensitive. To him, a touch is a blow, a sound is a noise, misfortune is a tragedy, a joy is an ecstasy, a friend is a lover is a god, and failure is death. I'm going to emphasize that last word again. Failure is death. To many of our gifted kids, that's exactly what it feels like. They feel things on such a deep, personal level that there's nothing halfway with these guys. A researcher by the name of Dabrowski did a lot of research in this field and started to look at some areas of intensity or oversensitivity that was showing up amongst this population. And although some of this research, they've had a hard time replicating some of the areas that we're going to talk about initially here, two of the areas that continually come up in the research around giftedness is this idea of intellectual intensity or overexcitability, and this idea of emotional overexcitability. But there are some other areas I want to talk about as well, because I think it just paints a big picture that's important for everyone. So to start off, let's start with intellectual intensity. This is something that most people are most familiar with. It is a that need to learn for the sake of learning. It is that ability to find out deep, complex meanings between things. And it's what we most often think about when we think of intellectual giftedness. But that's not the only area of intensity that many of our gifted individuals demonstrate. There's also something called psychomotor overexcitability. This is the need to move for the sake of moving. It's the need to process the world through talking. It's kids who have psychomotor overexcitability or psychomotor intensity when they get emotionally distressed. Oftentimes they'll be the ones who will seek out sensory stimulation in a lot of ways. They'll start moving more. They'll become distracted looking from the outside when really its origins are something quite different. Another area of overexcitability is the sensual domain. In the sensual domain, those are your five senses. So people who have overexcitability in this area, oftentimes it's going to come out as the one who is overly reactive to the sense of smell or the visual stimulation in an environment. They may be oversensitive to lights or sounds. They may be able to tell when you've changed your laundry detergent almost immediately, for example. It's those five senses. And when you get overstimulated in these areas, one of two things tends to happen. Either you actively seek out additional stimulation or you actively withdraw from stimulation. And that's a little bit about sensual overexcitability. I have that. I have an extreme love of the arts. It stems from this sensual overexcitability area. So that's another way that giftedness may come out. Imaginational overexcitability is me to a T. It's part of the reason why I also write fiction and not just the nonfiction that I write. Imaginational overexcitability has to do with having a vivid imagination, being somewhat lost in a fantasy world. This can happen when a student is bored in class, for example. For me, the way it plays out, I have technicolor dreams, and I do mean like dream sagas. I have these big cliffhanger blockbuster movies that happen in my dreams. It usually then shows up in my writing later on, but that's really coming from that imaginational overexcitability domain. It started when I was very young, probably a reaction to being bored in class as I look back in retrospect. And then finally, the emotional intensity. And emotional intensity is what we're really here to talk about today. I love some of the chats that you guys have put on here talking about emotional intensity as a superpower when it comes to channeling your feelings or being able to express it through art, feeling kind of overly stimulated about the environment, having a hard time sometimes maybe connecting with others just because of that emotional piece. And we're going to break down that emotional intensity even more. Really, a good way to think about emotional intensity is that constant over hyperactivation of your emotions. And so nothing's ever halfway. You're either happy, 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 or you're sad, sad, sad. Usually you're vacillating between happy and sad at a rate that's ridiculously fast, maybe too fast. It can also come out in terms of being highly creative or very expressive through art. Sometimes it's you develop a level of empathy that's almost too deep, almost too painful, and the world then becomes almost a painful place to exist. But all of these things are normal for our gifted population, and they can often be misunderstood. As a matter of fact, as I'm going through these 5 areas of intensity that typically show up with our gifted population, I'm sure there's a few diagnoses that may have come to mind that some people experience. Things like ADHD, when you are really maybe at psychomotor overexcitability, or perhaps you might have some things come to mind when you think of emotional intensity. That's usually the one, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But here's the big thing that's probably the most important concept that we're going to cover tonight. And that's really understanding the truth of what it means to be gifted. You see, when we're gifted, I like to think of it as a two-sided coin. So on one side, we've got our cognitive intensity, right? We've got that intellectual intensity that serves us so well. It helps us problem solve. It makes the world a more interesting place because of the connections that we can see. But on the other side of that same coin, sometimes are these really deep emotions that can become super overwhelming at times. In fact, those emotions can sometimes take over our lives and bring out some sadness at times or some feelings of being alone. And sometimes we don't understand that what we're really looking at are just two aspects of the exact same thing from two different perspectives. Like I said, on one side of that coin, you're going to find cognitive intensity. And in our culture, there's all kinds of things we have to say about cognitive or intellectual intensity, right? It's really cool. Oftentimes it's awesome. In fact, you may hear some really specific phrases when people are referring to cognitive intensity. They may think of your child and refer to your child's cognitive prowess and say things like, wow, he's so smart. He's so able to problem solve, and that's so cool. Or maybe they're going to say, wow, she just really has a knack for the medical industry. She's just going to cure cancer one day. I'm just sure of it. She's so smart. Sometimes we may look at a young man who's really good at programming or really good at innovation and say, oh my goodness, that's the next Steve Jobs. That's who that's going to be. And all of these things are exciting and positive. What a great leader they may think with that person who's demonstrating their cognitive intensity, or at those times when our child is demonstrating those cognitive intensity traits. But there's another side to the coin, and we often don't talk about that other side. When you flip that coin over, that's when you have emotional intensity. Remember, I said initially that of those areas of overexcitability, it's cognitive intensity and emotional intensity that most typically show up. So how do we refer to emotional intensity? What are some of the words that we use when we're trying to decide how to refrain or how to talk about emotional intensity? Well, emotional intensity isn't characterized as well in our environment, in our culture, is it? Oftentimes we'll hear things like, ugh, he's being so emotional, as if that's somehow a bad thing. Maybe even we're guilty of telling our own children, don't be so dramatic. Why are you being so dramatic with everything? Or maybe if our child is in middle school or in high school, we may use the phrase emo. He's so emo, to mean he's so emotional. Sometimes the word crazy is even tossed around. None of these things are good things. And unfortunately, because of our culture right now, our kids grow up believing that half of who they are as a human being on the planet is to be celebrated. But the other half of who they are is something that they're really ashamed of. In fact, they might even think a lot like this quote that I threw up from Frozen that says, "Don't let them in. Don't let them see. Be the good girl you always have to be. Conceal, don't feel. Don't let them know. Oh my goodness, now they know." See, our gifted kids grow up believing that part of who they are is somehow inherently flawed. That those very gifts that make them able to do ballet or make them able to paint or make them able to feel on a deep level somehow also is the thing that they need to be most embarrassed about, because our culture has labeled it as something bad. Our culture has said that if you are that emotionally intense, if you interact with the world with that degree of passion and if with that degree of emotionality, that somehow that's wrong. And tonight, what I really want you to walk away with is the understanding that we need to redefine that for our kids. For our kids, it is normal to be emotionally intense. And we need to redefine that for them so that they stop believing that half of who they are as a sentient human being on the planet is somehow flawed. We need to use different words to characterize emotional intensity. Better words that more capture more appropriately all that it means to be emotionally intense. We need to remind them that this is normal. For them, for a gifted individual, for a gifted adult, we need to tell ourselves and our kids that being highly emotional is normal. And then we also need to say something else. We need to tell them what emotional intensity really is. And I alluded to it a minute ago. Emotional intensity, probably the best word that I know for it, is passionate. And what on earth on this planet has ever been created without a high degree of passion? Passion is what enables us to get through the hardest things in life. Passion is what enables us to achieve our dreams. Every single thing that's ever been created on this planet has been created from a place of passion. One of my favorite ways to conceptualize giftedness came from a friend of mine, actually, who used to say it like this when we would talk about what does it mean to be gifted. Gifted people paint the world in bold while everyone else is painting in pastels. And I think that's true. I think that's exactly what our gifted population experiences day in and day out. So what do we really know about giftedness? We know that the emotional intensity is not a bad thing. We know that it's something to be cherished. It's something to be honored. But why is that? Well, the truth lies in what we now know about the emotional attributes of how children who are identified as gifted develop. They have certain characteristics that are common between them that are developed in such a way that it becomes the very assets that we're looking for. High performance standards. A couple of you guys have alluded to this a little bit in the chat, and I know every time I do a workshop on this, it's something that comes up. High performance standards. In its most underdeveloped form, we would call that perfectionism. But really, high performance standards is so much more. And we'll break down each one of these and how to build them in just a minute. Internal motivation. Our gifted population are hardwired to be motivated to learn. This doesn't mean that they're motivated to learn what we teach them in school sometimes, but when it comes down to their areas of interest, to the things they're passionate about, to understanding how the world works, this population is excited and internally motivated to learn. They have a moral maturity that is also naturally occurring. They get the big picture of ethics in our planet. They're the ones who react strongly to that Laura McLaughlin commercial that happens during the holidays every year with the polar bears and the animals that need to be rescued from the shelters and all of that. They understand the bigger picture of what's happening. And they're resilient. They're hardwired to draw on their strengths through their intellectual capacity and to build all of the necessary integration in the brain to really develop resiliency. This is something that comes to them quite naturally. It needs to be developed, though. It needs to be enhanced. Another aspect of their emotional attributes is self-actualization. They wrestle with the to be or not to be question. I'm sorry, I got distracted. Yes, there is a PowerPoint that is playing. It should be showing on your phone, but if not, shoot me a message and I will send it to you. But yeah, there is a PowerPoint. I don't know why it's not coming up on your Android phone. If you're on my website, it should be showing up for you. It can also show up through YouTube potentially as well. It should be showing up there too. So I don't know. I'll have to fix that for you. If let me know if you're not seeing the PowerPoint at all. I can see it on my end. So let me know. Okay. So self-actualization is another piece to this. And I think I'll make the PowerPoint available to all of you guys as a PDF, and I'll send it out as a link. So as long as you signed up for this course, I'll give you the link for a PDF of the PowerPoint. That way you've got it as well. And then you can watch it and the replay, and then that way you'll have it all together if it's not working for you on your phones tonight. Sorry about that. Okay, so self-actualization, what's that? That's that kind of wrestling with the bigger picture of the to be or not to be question, and doing that at a really early age. Oftentimes as young as 4 and 5, they're wrestling with their purpose in the world and trying to figure out how to utilize their passions. And then empathy. Empathy is another thing that our gifted kids are hardwired for in a really profound and meaningful way. And then finally, emotional intensity, which actually is an attribute, which we'll cover in just one second. So the key really to helping our kids redefine normal and to embrace emotional intensity from a position of strength, the key to this really is going to be coming to it from the viewpoint of tools. What kind of tools do they have in their toolbox? How is this going to happen for them? And so the answer really is in those same skills that I just talked about through their, in fact, I'm going to go back to that slide because I think it's so important, through their high performance standards, through their internal motivation, through their moral maturity, through their resiliency, through their self-actualization, through their empathy, through their emotional intensity. That's how we're really going to help these kids embrace all that it means to be gifted and embrace that emotional intensity as the true attribute that it is. So how do we do that, like specifically? Okay, well, we have some tools at our disposal that can really help with that. They include things like normalizing your intensities, help reframing those intensities into a strength, developing emotional attributes, and teaching coping strategies. What I'd like to do this evening is take each one of those apart and see exactly what skills it takes to develop those and give you some specific ideas of ways that you can specifically utilize these. So I've developed a table for you. It should be coming up any minute now for you on your screens. And it has the tool, and then it has some specific strategies for both the parent and the child. Educators, this is a good tool for you as well. And when I send out the PowerPoint of this, you'll be able to read it a little bit more clearly. If your screen's like mine, it might not be quite as easy to read unless you go to a full screen. All right, let's take a look at the normalizing intensity. Okay. For our kids to embrace emotional intensity as the strength that it is, the very first thing we need to do is believe that it's a strength ourselves. We need to recognize all of the intensities that our kid has, and rather than pathologizing them and making them into something damaging, we need to reframe this and look at it from a position of strength. If it's a normal aspect of giftedness, then how can we enhance it for our kids so that they can embrace all of the positive strengths of this? We need to guard against catastrophizing any of it. Don't look at that strong emotion from a position of weakness, but look at it from a position of strength. And rather than say, oh my goodness, why am I so emotional? Or, oh my goodness, why is my kid so emotional? Perhaps the better question is, oh my goodness, what coping strategies do I need to help my kid develop so that they can embrace these a little bit better, embrace some of these intensities? You can help them regain perspective as well. These 3 strategies really help our children start to normalize the intensities that they're feeling. Another thing you can do is reframe these intensities into strengths. It's kind of what I was alluding to a minute ago. Intentionally look for ways to redefine emotional intensity into a strength. For example, rather than characterize it as being overly emotional, characterize it as being passionate. Rather than seeing it as a barrier, think about how can you reframe it into a strength. Are they being bossy or are they being a leader? Are they being curious when they ask 50 bazillion questions, or is it just that they worry too much? Look for all of the ways that we can characterize things into strengths. Another thing you can do, focus on the positive. Look for all of the positive ways that they are demonstrating it. Part of the reason why the question I asked tonight was, what are the superpowers that your child is displaying through their emotional intensity, is to help us all stay focused on the positive. I love some of the things you guys have already expressed in the chat box. I look forward to hearing some more from you guys. And then we can utilize the strengths of their cognitive abilities, all of those cognitive intensities, to help develop any lagging social emotional skill development. Now, social emotional skills is what most of us grew up calling emotional intelligence. The current phrasing for that now in education is social emotional learning skills, or SEL. But it's basically the same thing. It's looking at interpersonal skills and intrapersonal skills, things like self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and executive functioning skills. And when I talk about using cognitive strengths to help with any of this lagging skill development, what I mean is using the strengths of the intellect for that child to help realize where some of those lagging skills are in their social emotional framework. So being able, for example, to develop an emotional vocabulary using their cognitive skills, and then use that emotional vocabulary to talk about how they're feeling, which will enhance self-awareness, to talk about how someone else might be feeling, which would capitalize on naturally developing empathy and also build social awareness. Some additional tools that we have at our disposal to help our kids reframe emotional intensity into a superpower. The first one is developing emotional attributes. If we focus on developing our social emotional strengths, those 5 or 6 areas that I covered a minute ago, and we use some of those interventions to do that, and we really look at this as, how can I better develop empathy? How can I better develop moral maturity? How can I better develop emotional intensity? Then we're starting to normalize the problem. We're not making it a problem anymore, and we're looking at it from the framework of an underdeveloped skill, which is really what we see when we see children struggling with their emotional selves. If we look for opportunities to continually build those social emotional learning skills, and we focus on the positive by acknowledging the growth, figuring out the empowering questions we might need to ask around emotional intensity, and finding solutions from that framework. By all of that, we stop creating it into a problem, and we start dealing with it from a strength perspective, which is healthier and better for our kids. The only way we can really do this, though, is if we simultaneously build and teach some coping strategies. So some of these coping strategies that work most effectively for children with their emotional intensity are things like mindfulness. Mindfulness is another way of saying being aware of awareness. So helping kids learn to quiet the constant chatter in the brain. Gifted individuals talk to themselves incessantly. They're analyzing their world incessantly. And sometimes this can be really hard on our gifted population. And so the more we can teach kids to be aware of their awareness and pick and choose when they are kind of listening to that chatter versus not listening to that chatter, that's really a key with a lot of our gifted individuals. Teaching gifted kids to relax. That's another thing that's really important. In the book Emotional Intensity, I have some really specific strategies for teaching relaxation, including my favorite, which is called Breathing Colors. It's a specific way of doing deep breathing that includes a visualization component that can make it a lot easier for children to recognize when they're relaxed versus when they're not relaxed. And then discernment. And what I mean by discernment is learning to really discern your environment so that you can correctly perceive all of the emotionality that you're feeling. You see, for a lot of our gifted population, a lot of humans in general, we misperceive some of the emotional feelings that we have, labeling it in problematic ways or disease culture kinds of ways. So when we feel kind of that natural exhilaration that happens when we're preparing for an oral presentation or when we're going to meet somebody for the first time, sometimes we call that anxiety, and when we say anxiety, we mean something really negative by it, when really what we're feeling is a normal biological response to a new situation, and we don't call it normal, and so we tend to catastrophize it, and then we turn it into a problem when maybe it wasn't a problem before. This is not to say that some of our gifted individuals don't also experience very high levels of anxiety. Sometimes they do. But teaching mindfulness and relaxation for a student who is dealing with both their emotional intensity and diagnosable anxiety will also help, trust me. So discernment is kind of that third coping strategy that's really important in being able to begin to figure out at a really deep level kind of what's true about my environment, what's not true about my environment, what's true about my mental chatter, what's not true about my mental chatter, etc. We have a couple of additional skills that I want to talk about as well. And as I'm going through this, if you have some additional questions, please shoot them into the chat box and I will try to address them as we go along. I do have a couple of questions that were emailed to me, so we'll address those at the end, and you can save your questions for the end too. And don't forget, if you haven't already put in kind of how you conceptualize emotional intensity as a superpower, be sure to do so. I will draw those names when we finish up here. Okay, so a couple more tools to talk about. One is building relationships. So human beings, we're social by nature, and we're really kind of hardwired to connect with others. And so if we can really, as parents, support our children by developing strong relationships with them, if we're a teacher, if we can focus on building authentic, positive relationships with our students, all of these things are going to enhance the gifted child's experience around us and help normalize some of that behavior. If we can provide authentic, positive performance feedback. What do I mean by that? I mean, first and foremost, don't lie to kids about what's true, about what's going on with them, especially our gifted kids. They totally know. If they blew it on something, tell them they blew it on something, but do so in a way that's constructive. So don't just say, wow, what the heck were you thinking? Don't say it like that. You want to be more like, I like this part a lot. That was really good, but what about this part? So kind of really providing a level of feedback that is constructive, gives some specific examples of how somebody can change or develop or improve in the area that you want them to. Provide appropriate corrections. So when you're correcting, again, make it very specific, and then engage in stable reactions. And I got a question that came up, which I will address when I do questions, but I wanted you to make sure you know that I see it. So yeah, stable reactions from parents is really critical. Part of the way our kids develop a sense of permanence or a sense of what's real and what's not real in their lives is through our reactions. And so if we're gifted and our own emotional ability is pretty intense and we're not reacting in a way that's stable with our kids, we're actually kind of undermining their natural ability to develop some resilience. And so we want to make sure that we are engaging in stable reactions. Focus on communication. So we got to understand the nature of giftedness. We've got to understand this whole construct that I started off with. with failure being akin to death. Whole belief that failing is somehow similar to death or somehow indicative that I am less than is a really quintessential part of gifted children in particular. And part of the reason why some of them have a hard time taking academic risks, part of the reason why they engage in damaging perfectionism as opposed to high performance standards. So it's important that we understand the nature of this so that we can properly coach our kids. Be willing to hold kids accountable, focus on their strengths, but always seek first to understand the kids that we're working with, understand your own children. Ultimately, we need to change the message that we're giving to kids on a day in, day out basis. And before I go into exactly what that new message is, I want to answer a couple of these questions that have popped up. So one that just popped up in the chat box is, how can we persuade a science or math-minded individual who's emotionally intense to even be willing to try this kind of hocus pocus stuff called mindfulness? All right, that could be a tough one. Probably the best way to think of mindfulness, like I said, really is being aware of awareness. And so one way that you can really appeal to the science-oriented kid who is, you're really wanting to learn this, is to have them practice mindfulness with a specific thing. For example, mindful eating. Tell them it's a science experiment. You want to see how finely tuned they can develop their awareness. So when you're doing mindful eating, you're literally being aware of the act of eating. What does it feel like when you move your mouth? What does food feel like along your tongue? Is there a sensation that comes to mind? Is there a particular taste that comes to mind? If you had to draw a picture of that taste, what would that be? So really you're appealing to the observer in the scientist and appealing to that nature. And you just pick the one thing, the eating a cracker. What is that experience of eating a cracker? What are the 5 sensory inputs that come in that act? You can do the same thing with breathing, taking a deep breath. What does it feel like to have your lungs move oxygen in and out of your body? It's a level of hyper awareness that few of us ever engage in at any given time, but learning to turn your attention in that way, highly focused in that way, begins to start that process of becoming aware of awareness. Somebody who's really strong at mindfulness, who really has been practicing it for a long time, is able to be aware of all things going on in a single moment at an equal level. So nothing takes precedence over anything else, and to stay completely present within that moment. It is a very hard skill to develop, but starting with the observer, the internal observer, is a really great way to start. And that could really appeal to your kind of math, science geek person. Okay. Another question that came up in an email to me: how do we best channel the gift of emotional intensity? Well, first off, I love the fact that we're calling it a gift. That is awesome, because that's exactly my particular frame of reference. But how best can we channel it? By thinking of it as our passions, by really using that emotional intensity as something that enables us to be more in touch with the planet on a deeper way than we would be otherwise. I have a quick little story to share with you on this particular topic. Lest you think emotional intensity only impacts us when we're kids, I am well into adulthood, we'll just say it that way. I'm old enough that I have, kids who are adults, and my emotional intensity still tends to come out periodically. And fortunately, I work for an amazing boss. And my boss at one point, when I was having a very emotionally intense day, and I apologized at the end of the day and just said, I didn't mean for my emotional intensity to come out quite this way at work. I try not to do that. And he laughed and he said to me, that he really understood that emotional intensity is kind of this two-edged sword. It's something that enables me, as somebody had mentioned this earlier in the chat box, it enables me to be highly intuitive of others, to really pick up on emotional construct of things far earlier than the vast majority of my peers. but at the same time, it also causes me to wound really easily just by the sheer overwhelming nature sometimes of the planet and some of the things that humans do to other humans when they're very busy being unaware. So channeling the best parts of emotional intensity really is about, first and foremost, understanding that this is really normal so that I don't pathologize it, I don't catastrophize it, I don't make it worse than it is. And then learning when to utilize that skill. The same person asked me a secondary question and asked whether or not there's really a time when we should suppress our emotional intensity, like in the face of an emergency. And I would say no. I think as you learn to discern and as you learn to normalize this gift called emotional intensity, at that point, when there's an emergency, you don't become overly lost in the emergency. You really learn how to manage your emotions. So it's really not about suppressing our emotional intensity, which is really suppressing who we are as humans, but it's about developing our coping strategy and our self-management skill to a high enough degree that when we are in situations where being overly emotional could be compromising to our safety, that we know how to manage that. So I want to encourage us to reframe this. It's never about suppressing who we are as a human being. It's about enhancing those coping strategies so that we can be the best version of ourselves as a human being as we possibly can. And then the last question I want to tackle before I go into this changing the message part is, how can we explain emotional intensity to teachers so that our students aren't being mislabeled, our kids aren't being mislabeled, so that we're not pathologizing normal behavior, etc. Okay, well, my half joking answer to that is, hand them a copy of Emotional Intensity and Gifted Students. There's a part for teachers in every chapter, specifically for that reason. And I've had lots of parents do that, actually. But really, it's helping them understand what giftedness is to begin with. Because giftedness is not a score on an IQ test, as you guys well know. And it's not about being able to figure out math problems really fast or being able to, score really high on an achievement test. It's really all of these other things. It's about this way of interacting with the planet that's just plain deeper and different and bold when everybody else is painting in pastels. All right, so changing the message. How do we do this? I mentioned earlier that this is really about reframing for kids. And so how do we reframe? Well, let's take a look at some of the messages that we sometimes have. Sometimes we characterize the behavior that we're seeing in our kids as bossy. And what we need to do is learn that it's not really bossy. That's not what we're looking at. If we reframe this in a positive way, what we're looking at is leadership. Is all of those same skills that we call bossy really is leadership when it's a little bit more finely tuned. Stubbornness, another common characteristic that we sometimes think of with our gifted individuals. It's not stubbornness that we're looking at. If we reframe that into the positive version of itself, what we're looking at is perseverance. And perseverance is an important thing. We live in a culture where we don't tend to persevere on a very deep level. So perseverance is something we want our kids to do. We mentioned unhealthy perfectionism at one point in the conversation tonight. And rather than look at that, what we're defining as perfectionism, the kid just keeps working on the same project over and over and over until they get it right. And isn't that horrible? And why are they doing that? Why can't they let it go? Well, the positive version of that is high performance standards. You see, we would never be upset if J.K. Rowling spends forever working on a chapter in a book, because we understand that that's driven by a high performance standard. And as a professional author, we expect her to have that. Well, it's the same thing for our kid who spends forever and ever and ever on a single paragraph in an essay at school. It's the high performance standards. Yes, sometimes that can become crippling. And yes, we need to do something about it to support our children when it becomes crippling. But what we're looking at really is just high performance standards. Well, what about continual worry? Sometimes emotional intensity comes out in the form of continual worry. So there's another way to reframe that as well. That's empathy. The kid who is worried is the kid who's aware of things to be worried about. And oftentimes that awareness is coming from a position of empathy. Sometimes our emotional intensity comes out as excessive questions. We're questioning everything on a rather regular basis. Well, that excessive questioning is just curiosity. And curiosity is a really good skill to have, especially if you're passionate about things and you want to innovate and discover some other things. So excessive questioning, really, if we change that message, it's just about being curious. And then overly emotional is just what we've been talking about tonight. It's passionate. Our kids are emotionally intense. That emotional intensity, when we've rephrased it as passionate, is something that we want our kids to have. It's such an important skill, and I'm excited about it. So I started tonight with a quote that I thought was really important to start with. I want to end with a quote too before we get to our drawing. So this quote actually comes from my favorite Apple commercial. It's kind of hard to read on the screen probably, but you guys will get the PowerPoint so you can have it. And this quote, as a matter of fact, is the driving principle. I started a group on Facebook called the Intense Life Tribe. I think I've sent you guys a link for that. It's in one of the things I've sent you when you signed up for this webinar. But if you need that, just let me know, because I'd love to have you guys hang out with us there. But here's the quote that I love so much. Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them, but the only thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward. And while some may see them as crazy, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world usually do. That's what I feel about our emotionally intense kids. They are crazy enough to think that they can change things. They're crazy enough to not accept the status quo. Our job is to help harness that and enhance that for them so that they can realize that potential in a really dynamic way. So that kind of concludes most of what what I have for you right now. If you have some other questions, I would love for you to jot it in the text box. If you haven't written down your superpower for you or for your kid in terms of how it relates to emotional intensity, do that, because I will draw a couple of names in just a few minutes. I did want to take a couple quick moments, though, just to tease something I have coming on the horizon. One of the things I've been fortunate enough to do has been work with a lot of families who are dealing with emotional intensity in their house, as well as work with a lot of school districts and knowing how to best support our gifted population. So I'm really excited to announce that I have a new course, especially designed for parents and educators. It's called Raising the Intense Child. Friday, I'll be presenting some more information about that. It'll include some books. It'll include some specific modules and PowerPoints, as well as group coaching. And I'm super excited to bring it to you guys. I will send you guys some information about it on Friday. So if tonight was something where you felt like you learned something, that you felt like there was some benefit for your family or for your students, please check this out when I send this out, Raising the Intense Child. Okay, I don't see any other questions popping up. If you have any, please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know about it. In the meantime, it is time to draw a couple of names from the chat box. So I do use a random number generator to pick a couple of numbers. And let me just get a sense of who we've got here. Okay, so I'm reading people's stuff. 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, so I've got 2 names drawn. The first one is Christy Lang Hartman. You have won your choice of either Emotional Intensity and Gifted Students or 101 Success Secrets for Gifted Kids. They are paperbacks. So Christy, and then Mon M is the other one who also won. You get to choose one too. So if you would throw it in the chat, which book you would like, I will get in touch with you, I'm going to put right now in the chat box, let me get to the right page, my email address. So if you could email me your address so I know where to send the book and what book you want, that would be great. And thank you guys very much. I hope that you enjoyed tonight. I hope it was beneficial for you. And I'm just so excited that you were here and that we got an opportunity to do this today. I've put up on the screen, it should come up any moment now, some links so that you can see how to get in touch with me or how to join the Intense Life Tribe or be part of our newsletter. And I love that. Emotional intensity is passionate. Yes, 100%. Yes, yes, yes. You guys make me very happy just having that in there. Thank you. I will send out the PowerPoint tonight. And for any of your friends who you wanted to see this, but they didn't get a chance to, I'll send out a replay as well. And yeah, emotional intensity is passion. So thank you guys so much. Have a great, fabulous this evening. Gosh, this was so much fun. We'll do it again. I actually, before you leave, if you're still online, I am going to offer another webinar a little later on in the year. I have a new book coming out called Letting Go, Breaking Free from Stress and Anxiety. It's a book for girls, not specifically gifted girls, but certainly gifted girls will help. And yeah, I'll do a webinar around that because why not, right? And you are very welcome. I just got a nice little thing in the text box. Thanks for the phrases to reframe the traits into strengths. You are more than welcome. That is consistently the favorite slide ever, ever, ever. And Christy, thank you. I'm super excited about the book. The book has turned out so much better than I ever could have hoped. It's just a really fabulous book. So if you really want to make sure you learn everything, both about the course and everything else, you'll get the information from the course, absolutely, because you signed up for this webinar. But make sure you sign up for my Intense Life coaching newsletter as well. And that way you find out about some of the other things that are coming down the pike. All right. That's it. Thanks, you guys. Thank you so much. And I will send you the copy of this PowerPoint shortly.